This session, 3A, is titled Intersectional Quantitative Research. The presenters for this session are Heather, Sabrina, and finally Alexia and Sarah. And Zuzana is going to be serving as discussant for the session. We're first going to invite Heather, who's going to give a presentation entitled Beyond the Binary, Understanding Gender, Sex in COVID-19.
So good afternoon. Thank you to the organizers first for hosting this event and creating such a wonderful and welcoming virtual conference. My name is Heather Shattuck-Heidorn, and I'm a co-founder and assistant director of the Harvard Gender Sci Lab. Today, I'm going to talk about our work aiming to understand how gender sex is operating in the COVID-19 pandemic. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the lab because it helps to frame our COVID-19 work. Formed in 2018, our lab primarily focuses on understanding how gender sex is modeled in the biosciences from both a theoretical and a methodological perspective. Our lab is interdisciplinary. We have historians of science, epidemiologists, philosophers, biologists, and others working side by side to understand the conceptualization and operationalization of gender sex in diverse domains, from issues of contemporary sperm quality to evolutionary hypotheses considering innate and gendered preferences. Often, our lab works to contest the assumption in the biosciences that biological outcomes that differ between men and women, with examples including stress hormones, aspects of immune function, or disease states, must be mediated by sex-linked pathways, such as those related to gonadal hormones, the 23rd chromosomes, or other aspects of innate sex. We also document how differences between sexes assumed to be related to sex itself, such as Alzheimer's prevalence or drug metabolism, may be better accounted for by other variables, such as age or body weight. We argue that gender as a multi-level intersectional variable is generally underconsidered in the biosciences, yet has pervasive effects on human biology. In the spring of 2020, at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, our lab members were thrown into the virtual environment. Many of us found ourselves frantically grappling with the lack of childcare or suddenly switching to teaching or learning online. We were all, like everyone else, hyper-focused on the pandemic. As demographic data on cases and deaths began to emerge, it became clear that in many places, more men than women were dying of COVID-19. We watched as, in this new domain of COVID mortality, a familiar story began to take shape. Reports of sex disparities were often accompanied by causal claims that attributed them exclusively to innate sex differences. Estrogens, androgens, the Y chromosome, and deep evolutionary differences between men and women were all considered to explain the sex disparity in COVID mortality rates. We were struck particularly by the lack of engagement with evidence for pre-existing and widespread gender-linked health disparities between and among the categories of men and women. Here, before we go further, I'd like to offer a quick note on the use of this language, the categories of men and women. In COVID, and indeed in much of human biology and biomedical research, these categories are used in data collection without clarity as to whether they refer to reported sex assigned at birth, self-reported gender identity, or even third-party assumptions. In my own work and in our work at the Gender Sci Lab, we've questioned the utility of these categories, both for understanding the variation present within human biology, but also for being able to understand biological outcomes associated with gender diversity. Here, we have 3 pieces that we've produced over the last year that challenge these binary and unclear data recording practices. In the current work, however, we're largely limited to understanding COVID cases and mortality as they are recorded in state and national level data. And so we use the categories as they are used in those data sets with the recognition of and a challenge to their limitations. Early on in the pandemic, we published some pieces aimed at giving light to contextual factors important to understanding the apparent increased mortality among men. We noted that this was also seen in other coronavirus pandemics, but was later understood to be nearly completely accounted for by comorbidities, age, and sex differences and occupational exposures. Other work published at a similarly early time also challenged the idea that innate sex lay behind men's mortality. Researchers examining all COVID deaths in Massachusetts, for instance, found that the sex difference was not different than what would have been expected given the pre-existing tendency for men to have greater mortality, largely due to differences in chronic conditions. To better understand the COVID-19 claims and data, we began tracking COVID-19 cases and mortality rates by sex in the United States early on in the pandemic, manually collecting and updating the data weekly from state-level public health websites. Our data set became the first and most comprehensive sex disaggregated breakdown of COVID-19 cases and mortality by state in the US. We made these data publicly available and contextualized by offering charts and figures examining the findings in relation to population size and age structure. Even in the early days of this pandemic, it was clear that the apparent sex difference was far from straightforward. The male to female mortality rate ratio varied widely across states and over time. For example, in New York, the initial wave of the pandemic had startlingly high mortality among men. Yet nearby Connecticut at the same time had nearly equal male and female mortality rates. Again, in New York, the high mortality of men then quickly dropped. From May 2020 onwards, our tracker demonstrated that the sex disparity in New York had greatly decreased in magnitude. As the pandemic wore on, it also became clear that there were severe disparities across racialized groups in the US that replicated pre-existing health disparities. Compared to white Americans, COVID-19 mortality rates could be close to 4 times higher among non-Hispanic Black Americans and up to 3 times higher among Hispanic or Latinx Americans. Data and theoretical pieces laid out how these racial disparities were not due to innate biological susceptibility, but rather represented the effects of racism at the interpersonal, institutional, and structural levels. For instance, COVID-19 outcomes were patterned by social and structural factors, including racialized and economic segregation, crowded housing, and neighborhood poverty level. However, no reports examined how mortality varied by sex within race, or how the apparent sex difference in mortality varied across race. Motivated by the importance of further understanding the clear racial disparities and the apparent sex disparity, we collected all available US state-level data that would allow us to conduct a sex by race analysis. We hypothesized that if there was a strong sex-driven biological contributor to the apparent sex disparity, there should be relatively similar sex differences across social groups. Conversely, if the reason for the sex difference is largely due to social factors, we would expect to see variation in the sex difference between social groups. Based on the results of previously cited analyses, we expected that Black Americans would have higher COVID-19 mortality than white Americans, but we did not know what analyzing race by sex mortality rates would reveal. Our results were stark. We found that Black men had much higher mortality rates than any other race or sex group, revealing a particularly vulnerable subgroup. But contrary to the common story of men as uniquely vulnerable, Black women had 3 to 4 times the mortality rate of white men or Asian Pacific Islander men. We also found that the sex disparity in mortality varied widely between racial groups. The mortality difference between Black men and Black women was much larger than the corresponding disparity among white men and white women, or among Asian Pacific Islander men and Asian Pacific Islander women. Additionally, our analyses revealed significant racial disparities within sex. The difference in mortality between Black women and white women was nearly 4 times greater than the sex disparity between white men and white women. For us, the magnitude of the variation in the sex disparity between racialized groups, as well as the fact that Black women had much higher mortality than white or Asian men, gave evidence that, while there might be some link to innate sex operating in the disparity, social and contextual factors were likely driving the mortality differences. I want to note here that the analyses and the figures displayed here and in the next 2 slides were prepared by GSL members Tamara Rushevich, who's a graduate student at Harvard School of Public Health, and Caroline Danielson, a researcher for the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, and Dr. Kay Lee, a postdoc at Washington University. Working as a collaborative team to further understand the apparent sex disparity varied, in the spring of 2021, we analyzed more than a year of data from our COVID tracker. We found that throughout the pandemic, the sex difference in case rates varied widely. Often, women had higher case rates than men, meaning that more women than men were receiving positive tests for coronavirus. I apologize that the x-axis is missing on these graphs, but it's always May 20 to May 2021. Meaning, so more women than men were receiving positive tests for coronavirus, which is possibly due to their concentration in frequently tested industries, such as healthcare workers, but also possible due to exposure or to willingness to test. Many states resembled Louisiana, with women having slightly higher case rates throughout the pandemic. However, there are states with little difference in case rates, such as Michigan, or even in which men had higher case rates, such as Texas. The sex disparity in case mortality rate, while nearly always higher in men, also varied quite widely. In a few states, men and women had nearly equal mortality throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Connecticut and Massachusetts are two examples. In others, men had starkly higher mortality right from the beginning. In still others, the disparity emerged over time in the pandemic. The tendency of women to have higher case rates becomes important when considering the higher case fatality rate of men. If, through concentration in industries like healthcare and education that mandate testing, women had a higher percentage of mild or asymptomatic cases diagnosed, this would decrease their case fatality rate relative to men. The variation in the sex disparity in mortality is also evident if we consider data across the US. Now, I know this figure is quite busy, but I'm going to unpack it for us. Overall, there's a male bias in the mortality rate ratio from COVID-19. On average, men had higher mortality than women. You can see that most of the lines on this graph, which each represent a state, is above 1.0. 1.0 would be when men and women had equal mortality rates. However, there is significant variation in the mortality rate ratio, not only over time, but also between places. Here, each state is a gray line. The black line is the average for the US. Some states are nearly always at a high rate ratio. Consider Texas, the orange line, which often has a rate ratio near 1.5. And while on average, the rate ratio is above 1, we can see that some states like Connecticut, the green line, frequently have rate ratios below 1, indicating that women had a higher mortality rate than men at those times. Rate ratios also change over time. At the very beginning of the pandemic, New York, the blue line, had a starkly high male mortality rate, above 1.5. You can see then that it quickly drops. As the pandemic wears on, deaths in New York become at times more equalized between men and women. But you can also see that the rate ratio climbs again later in the pandemic. Whoops. Sorry guys, I have two screens open and I lost one. In all, our lab has demonstrated that the apparent sex disparity in COVID-19 mortality, previously primarily viewed as evidence of innate sex differences, varies widely and extensively between the social categories of race, over time, and between places. What does this indicate? Well, for us, it's clear that the sex disparity in mortality is highly influenced by social factors that vary across time and space, likely linked to gender in conjugation with race, social class, and other biosocial factors. Gender-related variables that may contribute to the observed heterogeneity and patterns of sex disparities include gender-linked health behaviors and occupational exposures, which can intersect with other socially salient variables such as race and ethnicity or socioeconomic status. Gender influences both exposure to the virus and susceptibility to severe outcomes, such as mortality. Occupational work segregation or adherence to behaviors such as mask wearing mediate viral load and therefore disease severity. Chronic diseases, which are differentially distributed across men and women due to both gender and sex-related factors, are also important contributors to COVID-19 progression and outcomes. As emphasized by our analysis of race and sex in COVID-19 outcomes, a more nuanced and accurate picture of risks emerges from analyses of interactions between variables, as opposed to unidimensional analysis of social variables. In all, what we found with COVID-19 has ended up being a familiar story. An outcome was biological in nature, in this case, virus case rates and mortality, though we also have a paper forthcoming examining the actual immune response in COVID-19 infection. Because the outcome differed between the sexes and was biologically measured, innate sex was presumed to be the primary, if not sole, causal factor. Instead of a reductive approach mistaking differences between men and women to be mediated primarily by sex, our approach to COVID-19 sex disparities embraces an understanding of SARS-CoV-2 as a biological agent embedded in social context. Our data do not prove that sex biology has no role in COVID-19 outcomes, nor do we prove that social factors underlie the patterns we observe, but it does discredit single-factor approaches that are not sensitive to contextual variation. In part, the purpose of our lab is to investigate and analyze such claims around human gender sex, and to offer conceptual and methodological frameworks to the biosciences to practice better modeling of gender sex as a biosocial force. Despite increased recognition of how biosocial forces such as poverty or racism act on human biology, COVID-19 demonstrates that for gender, such a perspective continues to be sorely needed. And here I just want to recognize that our work at the lab is a fully collaborative effort None of this work is done by me alone, and I really appreciate the team, especially the data tracker collection team, which has some really stellar undergraduate students and graduate students on it. And I also want to recognize that parts of this talk are from papers recently published or that are forthcoming or under review. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to discussion.
Thank you for the presentation. And the second presenter is Sabrina, who's going to be talking about about this paper entitled Intersectionality Traveling into Quantitative Research, or Do We Underestimate Quantitative Research?
Yes, hi everyone. Can you see me and also my colorful presentation? I'm Sabrina from Berlin, and I'm talking about intersectionality traveling into quantitative research. And for me, the question is, because I'm coming from quantitative research, is quantitative research underestimated? So when feminist studies examine gender and especially gender differences, imputative homogeneity of gender groups, an intersectional perspective is needed. I'm sure you all are aware of the concept of intersectionality, which comes from Black women's movement to analyze the interactions of multiple experiences of inequality. We heard in the last session a little bit about different intersections. It is especially needed for understanding social inequality and underlying mechanisms, which often remain underestimated in traditional statistical analyses. For feminist perspectives, intersectionality is needed in order to not overrate the role of gender over other socially constructed categories of difference and similarity, and to reflect possible exclusions in the research process. So, as for intersectional sciences, reflecting own positionings as a scientist is important. A little bit about me. This is me, my little nerd from the very beginning. I was born in the old GDR, a country which doesn't exist anymore, in a village with family experiences of expulsion, integration politics, hunger, and also political perpetration. I'm a queer feminist person who was trained very quantitative at Humboldt University in Berlin. I also did neurosciences, and I teach, for example, quantitative methods at Sigmund Freud University Berlin or also TU Braunschweig. I was also a scientific assistant at the United Nations with quantitative research, and now I do my PhD with a mixed method approach in the field of intersectional psychology and therapy. The presentation today is based on results of a working group on intersectional quantitative research from Humboldt University of Berlin. We aimed at understanding the international debate on intersectional quantitative research, at understanding how it can travel from qualitative research into quantitative research, and finding international best practice examples from health studies, because I'm coming from psychology. So I'm not sure about your cultural heritage and universal training, but for talking about intersectional quantitative research, I feel it does matter. It does matter if you are coming from qualitative research. Maybe you are hesitating to bring the concept of intersectionality into quantitative research because maybe you think it can't really fully meet the requirements of the concept. Or if you're coming from quantitative research like I do, you might feel that qualitative researchers with only little training in statistics sometimes underestimate the complexity of quantitative research possibilities, because additive statistic models summarize both additive and multiplicative arithmetics, and therefore an additive statistical model can reduce the intersectional demand to not only add social categories. So either way, from which direction you're coming, I feel we can combine this to a very nice new dinner. And besides this methodological fight sometimes between qualitative and quantitative research, we can be often found, I strongly advocate to decide on the methodology based on research question. And I want to present now how Les Migras, a social psychological center for lesbian migrants, operationalized gender, sexual orientation, and migrational background in a study from 2012. The study examined the experiences of violence and multiple discrimination from lesbian and bisexual women and trans in Germany. As the questionnaire was in German, I translated it for you. At first, they asked about like gender self-concept, and they say, we kindly ask you to describe your gender self-concept. To answer this question, the only thing that matters is your personal feeling. So they say you can, in each column, you can cross one category for you. So we have all the different variables, and today we heard a lot of the pros and cons of having multiple options. But what's interesting to me is first this column, because I feel it's there are similarities to the fuzzy gender scale from Lena, who's also here today, where you can have like a dimension between you feel very male or female from on a Likert scale from 0 to 10, for example. And I feel in this column from Les Migos, they also try to show this gender fluidity. And I also find interesting the category in the very bottom, like I refuse to categorize myself, because also in this conference, I always have the feeling gender is very present. And I heard from Zuzana, for example, like until the policies have the binary category, we need to do the research, and I agree. But still, also I, for myself, I refuse to categorize myself with gender. So I really like that they have this option. This option is also to find at Beigang, for example. So I like the idea. They also ask about how often is your self-chosen gender recognized usually? So they ask about never, sometimes, mostly, always. And I find this interesting because I have the feeling that they are trying to avoid asking about what gender were you given at birth, but in a way you can also feel to get a clue about it, and they stay focused on the self-concept. Other people, for example, Beigang and colleagues, suggest to ask for the at birth given gender, and I think it's interesting. For example, in Germany, I think till 2018, there are different options now. You can decide between female, male, diverse, and also you can leave this category open. They also ask about relatedness to lesbian ways of living, because they feel like not every woman all over the world use the word of lesbian, which sometimes is referred to as a Western concept. So they ask different questions to find out if people live with a woman or ever have slept with a woman, or if the person they are living together is defining themselves as a lesbian. So they have a more broad understanding to include people. And the same they are trying to do with the multiple discrimination questionnaire. So they also stay with the self-descriptions. They ask, for example, which of the following attributes are or were used to discriminate or exclude you? So I like the idea that they ask for example, putative religion or putative migrational background. And we heard today in the morning that it's good to have open questions. So they do it in number 7. How do you describe your national, ethnic, cultural identity and belonging? But as you know, when you're doing statistical analysis, it's hard to put these open answers now in categories. And I like the idea that they show what kind of categories they have already in mind in number 8. So first they ask for an open description, and then they offer their ideas. And in the next step, in number 9, they ask, if you're having a family-related migration background, how do you call yourself in this context? So they also ask about belonging. And also here they stay on the self-concept, and they don't explicitly ask about legally effective factors like residency status, which is also suggested, for example, by Baumann. and colleagues who give a good overview about equality monitorings. They also ask, for example, how do you usually are you usually perceived as German, which also shows the discrepancies maybe in the self-concept and society. Social difference categories themselves are very relevant, but they are not the one and only thing of interest. Moreover, also variables that can map social, historical, and geopolitical circumstances of life are important. So-called context variables, we heard today many of them. Placing the variable of sex or gender in context with context variables, you can have, for example, having children, access to childcare, length of parental leave, sole or shared parental leave. And they all are underlying circumstances of life situations, social roles, and norming. And as Zuzana showed us this morning, leave policy is important also for men. Under the notion of solution-focused variables, Loftus and Campo, for example, cite examples of variables and operationalizations in health sciences. Through those solution-focused variables, social problems such as structural disadvantages can be made clear, and the surveyed social difference categories can be made more precise and contextualized. Okay. Let's talk about intersectionality-informed data analyzing, because I'm not sure, how do you feel? I like mathematics and I like numbers, but sometimes, excuse my language, that can be a pain in the ass, of course. So how do we do this with all these open intersectional-informed variables? To analyze data from an intersectional perspective, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but when moving beyond the binary, we need to be creative in statistics, as quantitative research often contains yes and no questions coded in 1 or 0, such as 0 for men and 1 for women. In order to meet this challenge, I suggest to create, not I, but I agree, but for example, Rouhani and Spearing suggest to create as many identity variables, as many attributes as possible. So for example, for gender, they have 5 categories, and to combine them in many subgroups to provoke intersectional relations. Of course, this can be tricky, but there's like an easy trick. You can create the binary dummy variables, or including interaction terms in the statistical model. So for example, you can be creative for a metric scale from nominal scaled identity variables, for example. So for gender, you can create, for example, the dummy variable, which is also binary, but we have the cis female as one variable and the non-cis female as the other one. So we have still 2 to do the mathematics, but it's not only the male-female stuff. The same if you do it, for example, for D2, trans female. So trans female like the standard, and the other is like the non-trans female. So because in the morning we discussed, maybe it sounds weird for people if you can just cross female, male, and others, because who wants to be other? And othering processes comes along with a lot of discrimination, as we know. So these dummy variables give a nice option to go around it. And I want to talk about the analyzing processes itself. For example, we have the correlations, and the time is going faster as I thought. So I just want to show a best practice example from Reisen and colleagues. They showed in a study examining the impact of gay discrimination and ethnic discrimination on depression and gay collective identity in the US, with 301 HIV-positive Latino gay men, the intersecting relations between identity variables, context variables, and output variables. So due to multicollinearity and that independent variables can correlate together. So we can only measure tendencies, not causalities. So to get more complex analyses, we need regression analysis. And now I need to jump a little bit because I want to present not only the multi-level models, but I want to present a special form of regression analysis in form of multi-level models, which combines, and this is on the bottom, it's a hierarchical logistic set regression. It's also used by Reisen and colleagues, which I was talking about. And they use it to group different sets together. So they're not asking only about the discrimination effects and how it affects the output, but they put the discrimination together, the ethnic and the gay discrimination in one set and put them in the regression analysis, and also the same for demographic sets and also, for example, for gender nonconformity set. So this way, the whole experience of discrimination is considered in the model because both of the portion of shared gay and ethnic discrimination and the single gay or ethnic discrimination on the prediction of the outcomes are included in the model. Grouping identity-related variables into sets supports the intersectional assumption of non-hierarchical social identities and associated experiences of discrimination. So now my last slide, the take-home messages. In sum, for an intersectionality-informed quantitative analysis, the following aspects are of relevance: examining the impact of identity variables and the differentiated combinations to take multidimensionality of identities into account, examining heterogeneity of each identity variable to avoid essentialization of intersectional subgroups, including identity-related context variables on micro and macro level, to prevent individualization of societal phenomenon, and focusing mediation and moderation effects to prevent simplifying causalities. So intersectionally traveled already far into quantitative research. So this was my question in the beginning. And quantitative research offers multiple options to analyze data with an intersectional lens. And this was not my last presentation slide, but this is, thank you for your interest in intersectionality-informed quantitative research, and I'm happy to hear your ideas and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina, for your presentation. And our last presentation for this session is going to be from Alexia and Sarah. Their presentation is entitled Intersectional Feminist Intent in Research and Evaluation, Sharing Learning from Quantitative Impact Evaluations.
Hi, everyone. I'm Barakat. I'm the co-head of program and influencing enablers at Oxfam GB, and I'm here today with Alexia Pretari, impact evaluation lead. And we will be presenting work that we have developed with our colleague Jaynie Vonk on learnings from bringing an intersectional feminist intent in quantitative impact evaluations. So just before we start, I've been having internet problems all day, and so if I get disconnected, then Alexia will pick it up. Okay, so let's get this started. So one way to sum up our work is to say that the personal is political, but so is the technical. Technical choices that we make are political. They are tightly linked to ethical consideration. And this is one of the ways that bringing an intersectional feminist intent, as well as our personal values, into research and evaluation can make a difference. Bringing an intersectional feminist intent to research and evaluation leads us to defining these as tools to bringing about, or contributing at least, to social justice through shedding light on different interacting systems of oppression and their impacts, and in particular, racist, capitalist, heteropatriarchal, and colonialist structures. Our impact evaluations are conducted by and for a large Northern international NGO that supports the implementation of intervention in a variety of contexts of what is called the Global South. Bringing a feminist intent to this work leads to questioning our position as researchers, the institutional frame in which these studies take place, as well as our positionality that is working in roles with a global remit using disciplines that are known for being technical and associated with a certain idea of neutrality or objectivity. And in the absence of explicit intent to challenge our own worldviews as practitioners, operating under the guise of this so-called objectivity, which is often the case with quantitative approaches, risks strengthening the status quo and reproducing dominant narrative, especially, again, sexist, racist, colonialist, classicist ones. So today in this presentation, we will be building on a body of quantitative impact evaluations that are quasi-experimental and for which we design context-specific survey tools, sampling strategies, and data gathering exercises. We will be sharing with you some of our reflections and learnings, and we will focus on a few points. We won't have time to go into the details or the nuances, but for more information, you can ask us or check out the papers or the abstract. And so for now, I'm going to hand over to Alexia.
Thank you. So the first thing I wanted to share is the fact that bringing intersectional feminist intent led to unpacking the variable that the conference is about, as well as the categorization of gender that the conference is about. And that variable has been taken for granted, and its unpacking is overdue, as Anna and a lot of different panelists as I've mentioned today. And indeed, binary sex sometimes, gender at other times had been used as a proxy for gender. But as we started bringing our personal values into that technical space, then we realized that we needed to unpack it further. What is it that we want to capture in this variable? What is it the proxy for, and why is it usually binary? And our impact evaluations have initially used binary gender categories, women, girls, or men, boys. And in recent years, we have added a choice of other to reflect our recognition of a variety of gender identities. And as it's been mentioned by Sabrina and by other before, we acknowledge that it's still very limited and it's othering in itself. So for us, allowing interviewees to self-describe is another step towards ensuring increased recognition and visibility. And another point about this variable is also the fact that we really need to be more comfortable with the prefer not to say or refuse to answer and missing data that is created. And this is the point Sabrina just made that really resonate with our work as well. The second point that I wanted to bring about the categorization of gender is the fact that in our case, the data that we work with is generated as a social interaction. So it's an interviewer that is conducting an interview and gathering this data. And by unpacking this variable that we took for granted, we also realized that more needed to be done in the training of interviewers to ensure that this variable is indeed self-defined as opposed to assumed by interviewers. And it also strengthened a point that we already had in mind and that we had identified as critical, which is that social backgrounds and identities of interviewers are really critical. And moving forward, we need to unpack further what there is in this social interaction in the act of carrying out a survey in a given context. And that's linked to context and safety that Sarah will cover later. Next slide, please. So in our work, we are now trying to bring intersectionality to the fore. So we're building on this concept that is rooted in Black feminist activism and theory, following the Combahee River Collective, Kimberly Crenshaw, or Patricia Hill Collins' works. And it requires us to really interrogate the different systems of power and the related social hierarchies, such as gender, race, and class in particular. And bringing this idea in the realm of impact evaluation, there have been three key technical components and ethical consideration attached that we've been considering. The first one is around who are we listening to and who is represented in the data. So it's about sampling strategies as well as interviewee-interviewer interaction. The second one is around the measurement tools, so the questionnaires, how different lived realities are represented through the choices that are made in a questionnaire and who makes that decision. And the third one is about systematically shedding light on lived experiences of a variety of people at the intersection of oppressions. So today I'm going to focus on the first and the third point. We're really happy to talk more about, offline or in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So the first point here is about being intentional in our sampling strategies, about whose experiences are represented in the data. And it requires first to identify dimensions of structural inequalities and their markers in a given context. Starting with the binary understanding of gender, we introduced random variation within the household in our sampling strategies to ensure representation of women and men in different positions within the household. And here I need to pause. We do not have resources in our work to do listing or census before sampling, nor do we have access to census data. And the first panel this morning also was all around the limitations around the way census data are framed as well. And the other reason why we introduced this random variation is that we also wanted to be able to easily pair interviewers and interviewees' gender identity, as that was deemed preferable in some context. However, we can expand on this binary approach to ensure representation of people at the intersection of several oppressions. So the first thing would be for any other characteristic that will vary within the household, for example, age. So introducing random variation within the household in terms of who is answering the survey will enable representation of a variety of experiences. The second one is if we consider characteristics that will vary across households, there are different scenarios depending on the prevalence of the characteristic that we are looking at in the population. And I would argue that combining with this intra-household variation in the sampling, if the proportion of the characteristics of interest is not large enough to enable meaningful statistical analysis, we could then oversample the households in this position. And this is, I think, the point Sabrina made around creativity is really resonated with me, as well as just to, again, it's like the intent first, and then we find the technical solution. The point that I'm not going to cover here is around considering who is asking, so who is doing these interviews, but we wanted to acknowledge that we think it's really important. And the second part of this slide around bringing intersectionality to the fore is really around intersectional analysis. And here again, expanding on what we've been doing in our quantitative impact evaluation, our starting point is that intersectional analysis could be done by using regression analysis with triple interaction terms. That will help us considering 4 social groups plus the impact analysis, because we're working in a counterfactual setting. So we always need that additional interaction term. And so that enables us to systematically look at the impact per social group, as well as testing for the significance of any differential impact across groups, and document how each social group experiences things differently in the absence of the intervention. So that's kind of documenting discrimination or different lived experiences. But the more dimensions we consider, and hence the more social group, the harder econometrically. And I'm not even talking about the size of each group. And conceptually, I think this triple interaction will still be based on the interaction of 3 binary variables, as well as assuming some forms of additivity. While intersectionality is not about additivity. So I think one way to work this around would be to conduct separated analysis and regression model for each social group. So similar to some of the work that Sabrina has been highlighting, rather than and using the interaction term with our impact assignment, with our intervention assignment, and then test across if this is possible technically. I'm going to stop here and hand over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Alexia. And thanks, Youngcho, for having moved already to the following slide. Okay, so how do we go beyond the binary? There are different ways to expand gender categories in survey practice, and there's been a lot of sharing of experience already on this today, so we won't be addressing this, and instead we'll be focusing on the decision-making process itself. So deciding which approach to go for should be examined on a case-by-case basis, and it would depend on 3 factors that we want to highlight. Before going into this, it's really important for us to note that this decision-making process will apply whether we're talking about diverse gender identities, as well as when we are trying to address and document other types of dimensions of structural inequalities. So for us, we use 3 factors. The one is use. Is there a need to gather information if it will not be used? Second, context. Which approach is more appropriate and culturally sensitive? In which language will best represent experiences? And finally, context again. And this is where we're specifically focusing on safety to decide which method is safer and whether it is safe at all to gather any aspect of this information that we're after. So centering safety for us is critical. In contexts where trans and non-binary identities are stigmatized, the act of gathering data on gender identity and asking people to share their identity has inherent risks. Safety as well as well-being need to be prioritized when deciding whether at all should we be gathering this data. If we can safely access and gather this data, then surveys provide the opportunity to highlight lived experiences that fall outside of what is considered the norm, quote unquote again. And so documentation and visibility would then become aims in their own right, with the power to shed light, to increase representation and contribute to transformation. But at the same time, it's really difficult to ignore that members of marginalized communities, and this includes trans and non-binary people, are sometimes already visible. And that with this visibility comes discrimination, oppression, and violence. So the opportunity to highlight how intersecting systems of oppression shape experiences, and specifically in the context of impact evaluation, how different people benefit differently from our intervention, should not come at the cost of putting people at risk. And this is perhaps more so the case if the interventions that we are assessing were blind to gender. So we ask the question, would it be ethical for an impact evaluation to shed light on trans and non-binary experiences, while the intervention that it is assessing does not put their experiences at its core, nor in terms of project inclusion, nor in terms of systemic change? And finally, following the feminist principle of nothing about us without us, we think that it is important, where possible and safe, and Kirsty has already made this point earlier today, to work with LGBTQIA+ activists to assess the need and the safety of data gathering, and to decide whether it can be used and how to use it to best portray the diversity of experiences and contribute to gender transformation. Next slide, please, Youngcho. So, in conclusion, does this mean that bringing a feminist intent to quantitative research and evaluation makes them gender transformative? Not quite. We think we're on the right track, but we still have a long way to go. And some of the challenges that we have left to address, I'll just mention maybe a couple quickly. So one is the intervention that we assessed are sometimes gender blind. They don't specifically consider needs and aspirations of women, trans, non-binary people, let alone taking into account race. And this makes that analysis of gender or intersectional gender transformation too premature or superficial. Second, for impact variations to be truly transformative, they need to drive action for change, and their findings need to be put into use in decision-making on strategies and budget. And again, Kevin made the same point this morning. But also, bringing in an intersectional feminist intent also brings attention to knowledge hierarchies. It is impossible not to see the power dynamics that exist in knowledge production, from design to products. Often in international development, the work of individuals from racialized groups is rendered invisible. We have taken steps to make this work visible in our evaluation products, but we need to go beyond small tweaks to drive structural changes. Beyond this, centering intersectional feminists leads us to question methodological and epistemological hierarchies. How do epistemology and methodological choices themselves limit the contribution of research and evaluation to the social justice agenda? And finally, just the last slide, please, Youngcho. We wanted to thank you for your attention today and just direct you, if you wish to know more, to the paper that we've written and that is published on Oxfam's Policy and Practice website. And if you wish to contribute to our Real Geek series, please drop us a line. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexia and Sarah. And now I'm going to invite Zuzana to share some thoughts on the 3 presentations in the session generally.
Thank you, Youngcho. Thanks for this opportunity to engage with these papers, where I got a bit of a head start with the extended abstracts. And in the case of Sabrina, a full paper. So I'm noting that also to flag that I'm going to draw on these papers that I had access to beforehand. So some points might not have been communicated in the presentations. So I'm going to start by highlighting some common themes and differences in relation to the theme of the session, focusing on intersectionality and quantitative research, as well as the conference. And then I'm going to include a couple of comments on the individual papers. So thank you also to all the presenters for sharing your papers, which I think are a testament to the power of the concept of intersectionality. The three papers demonstrate really well how far the concept has traveled across academic fields, but also beyond academic fields into areas like impact evaluation in development projects. And I think the ubiquitousness of intersectionality is also perhaps illustrated by the way it is introduced across the three papers. So while Sabrina and Sarah and Alexia introduced the concept, its development, and perhaps paid tribute to its authors, Heather's paper seemed to take intersectionality somewhat for granted, suggesting that we perhaps all already know what it is all about. And the three papers also differ in their aims, I thought. So Heather focused more on demonstrating the need for an intersectional analysis, as well as gender as a variable rather than biological sex. So she focuses on the what for and builds on her analysis of high-level data to call for data collection that would allow for further, more nuanced intersectional analysis. And Sabrina and Sarah and Alexia seem to start more from here and focus more closely on what comes after, on the how, the challenges of such data collection and analysis. But to come to the theme of today's conference, how do these papers attempt to go beyond the gender binary in quantitative research? So Heather's paper on understanding COVID-19 mortality rates draws on intersectionality to demonstrate the need to focus on gender as an explanatory variable rather than sex. And so the paper goes beyond the binary by drawing attention to further factors through which gender affects COVID mortality rates. It's not merely chromosomes or being born man or woman. It is also socially determined behaviors and situations that shape outcomes, including, for example, job segregation. At the same time, Heather also calls for collecting data on gendered identities to account for health outcomes of intersex, trans, non-binary, or gender-expansive people. Sabrina argues for going beyond the gender binary by including a gender variable that takes more values than the historically standard two, and also by paying attention to how such a gender variable would intersect with further identity categories. And similarly, Sarah and Alexia's paper discusses broadly two types of innovations. First, accounting for intersectional effects, and second, conceptualizing and operationalizing gender, not as binary, but also accounting for trans and non-binary people. So to differing degrees, all three papers, on the one hand, focus on accounting for multiple gendered identities in research, and on the other hand, insist on investigating the effects of gender as intersecting with further identity dimensions or dimensions of oppression. However, in my understanding, Heather goes a step further in her paper by emphasizing the sources of gendered variation, not only in outcomes, but also including it in her explanatory variables. So here, gender manifests not only as an individual property, but also as a structural power, which drives, for example, the gendered job segregation. That being said, this was mostly implicit, and it could be argued that the papers mostly remain within the bounds of considering gender a property of individuals or individual gender identity. And what I thought could be a question that all three papers could engage with more explicitly was the mere question of what is gender, how is it conceptualized, and does it, or perhaps does it not, for the purposes of this research, these research papers go beyond gendered identities. This is something that came up earlier today in more than one sessions, just defining gender in relation to one's research aims and research questions. And maybe if there is time in the part of this session, that's perhaps a question we could also engage with here. And since we're already, I think, running out of time, I will go on to share maybe just one or two observations or thoughts on the individual papers. And they mostly revolved around the already mentioned conceptualization of gender, but also intended audiences. So first, Heather, I just wanted to say that I thought your paper was neat and super interesting and also extremely timely. But throughout your abstract, I was wondering about your intended audience. You're making a strong case for a new intersectional perspective to a field where it seems to have been lacking, or to a question where it seems to have been lacking. And so I assume, in a way, to a new audience. And if this holds, I thought that it might be worthwhile to explain the concept in a bit more detail, and at the same time, perhaps acknowledge its origins and those behind it. Sabrina, from reading your paper, I thought that you provided a really nice overview of issues to be considered at various stages of research when attempting to incorporate intersectionality. But like with Heather, reading your paper, I was wondering about your intended audience. I understood it to be social psychologists, more specifically, perhaps social psychologists, specifically in Germany. And I thought you could perhaps focus a bit more on explaining to them why they should listen to you and why they should be interested in an intersectional analysis. What do they risk missing if they don't take intersectionality on board? And are there perhaps risks, benefits, or maybe challenges specific to incorporating intersectionality in social psychology specifically? And you also suggested in your paper that compared to qualitative research, objectivity might be gained by incorporating intersectionality into quantitative methods. But feminists have debated whether objectivity is achievable at all for quite some time. So I thought that you might engage more with why intersectionality is needed in quant methods and what could be gained from it. And finally, Sarah and Alexia, I thought your piece was very thoughtful and impressive in its efforts to balance a responsibility to gather relevant data with an ethical approach. And again, I found myself wondering about your audience. Is it Oxfam colleagues, or perhaps colleagues from similar organizations, or is it an academic audience? And either way, I would have been interested to see some examples that would illustrate what your approach contributes and what we stand to lose without it. Now, the extent of details provided might depend on the answer to the audience question, as I assume that if it's your colleagues, maybe they're already quite familiar with similar surveys and maybe less hungry for empirical details. And you also ponder the question of collecting data and highlighting the lived experiences of trans or non-binary people, even if their experiences are not at the core of the project. So I wasn't quite sure whether I understood this dilemma correctly, but it led me to wonder about how your surveys were constructed. Are they theory-driven? Does that theory assume a differentiated effect of the intervention on, for example, trans or non-binary people? And if not, how do you reconcile that with focusing on their experiences? And finally, kind of the so what question. And this partly also comes back to my earlier comment about conceptualizing gender. You speak in your abstract about designing a gender transformative approach. And I thought you could also unpack that a bit more. What is gender in your understanding, and in what ways is it to be transformed? And I'm going to stop there because we are seriously running out of time. So thank you all.
But thank you so much for this really great final session. I'm really happy that we were able to end our conference as a whole with such great discussions. Thank you everyone for your participation, your time, and sharing your thoughts and research. Thank you also, I would like to mention, to CRASSH and Nikki from CRASSH for all the support that made this conference possible in general. Finally, FemQuant runs monthly seminars and blog series where more discussions of feminist quant research continues. So if you feel like you are sad that this conference is only a one-day conference and you would like to continue this conversations, please keep posted for our further upcoming events. Follow us on Twitter, and also get in touch with us if you would like to contribute to either our seminar or blog series. Thank you everyone for today, and I wish you all had a great time, and I also wish we could meet again, both in person and online in the future. Thank you.